Hi and welcome to this presentation. So you might wonder who is this guy. He's a German football player, his name is Mesut Özil, and that quote is taken from a tweet from him somehow 3-4 years ago. So he said, "I'm German when we win, but an immigrant when we lose." I really like that quote, and actually I wanted to use it as a title for my paper. Unfortunately, someone arrived just before me, so I had to use a more formal academic title. So this is what we are going to talk about today. We are going to talk about nationalist moods, football, attacks against immigrants in Germany. Let me introduce myself. My name is Gabriele Pinto and I come from Rome, Italy, and I am a PhD student at Sapienza University. Let me introduce you what are the two main contributions of this paper. The first is to provide a conceptual framework that tries to establish a link between nationalism and attitude against immigrants. The second contribution is to provide empirical evidence of a relationship between sports nationalism and attacks against immigrants in Germany. So let me give you a flavor of what are the main results of my empirical investigation. I studied how attacks against immigrants varies in relationship with results of the German football team. What I find is that if the German football team wins, in the days after, attacks on immigrants decreases, while if the German football team lose, in the days just after that match, the attacks on immigrants increases. So now you may understand why this quote from Mesut Özil was perfectly fitted for this paper. Okay, so let's start with the theory. What is the traditional framework of the relationship between nationalism and immigrants? The traditional explanation tends to say that different type of nationalism have different type of relationship with attitude against immigrants. So while healthy, positive nationalism has a positive relationship with attitude against immigrants, ethnic nationalism has a negative one. So how we can put sports nationalism into this context? The main issue, I think, is to try to understand where banal nationalism falls in the two traditional categories of nationalism, if it is a positive one or a negative type of nationalism. To try to answer this question, I will try to give you three arguments. The first argument is that the difference between types of nationalism might not be as clear-cut as it looks. For example, look at these two pictures. Probably you don't know who is the guy with the Swedish t-shirt on the left, but you certainly know, I think, that you know who is the guy on the right, or you have probably seen it in the Capitol Hill assault in Washington. If you don't know who he is the so-called shaman. And why I put these two pictures? Because I want to highlight something that Wimmer clearly said, that healthy and morbid nationalism are not very different things. And I like how he says they are brothers rather than distant cousins. The second argument I want to bring you is the relationship between mood states and attitude against immigrants. To understand why this argument is important, let's see my third argument. Sport events affect mood, and through affecting moods, they can also affect individual behaviors. And now you can see the link with the second argument. So using these three arguments, I try to reconstruct the conceptual matrix by taking into account the interaction between moods and ideologies. What we obtain is a new matrix when we do not have any more nationalism types, but we have so-called nationalism modes. And how we arrive at that? We start from sports that affects moods and affects nationalism attitudes, or how I call it, nationalism moods. And we have two types of nationalism mood: a positive, inclusive nationalism mood and an identitarian, exclusive nationalist moods. And the two constructs will have two different relationship with attitude against immigrants. So now let's get to the empirical application. First, let me briefly discuss the data used. We use anti-immigrants attacks from the Harvig dataset. It's a very detailed daily register of attacks against immigrants in Germany in the period between 2014 and 2018. Is what you see here. As we can clearly see from the trend, from the end of 2016 and the beginning of 2017, Germany has seen an increase of attacks against immigrants that was related also to an increase of anti-immigrant attitudes and an increase of immigrant inflows in the country. While with respect to the football data, we use all the results of different tournaments of the German football team. So now let me explain you my identification strategy. We basically have a regression where on the left side of the regression we have a measure of the number of attacks against immigrants each day, while on the right hand side of the regression we have some treatment variable for days after a match of the German national team and the result of that match. Plus, we also add calendar effects to control for the fact that matches are played only in certain days, more frequently in certain days of the week, and also attacks against immigrants have a calendar effect, meaning that they have both a trend and they also happens more often in certain days of the week. So what we basically have is a dataset that can be represented as a matrix, where we have on one column the number of attacks, then we have our treatment variable for days after a match of the German football team, then we have a treatment column for days after a German football match team, and then we have our main variable of interest, that is a column with a dummy variable that takes the value of 0 or 1 depending on the type of the results of the German football team. To be more clear, if Germany wins, as such is in this example I show you now, the dummy variable of post-match and post-win will be equal to 1 in the 2 days after the match, while 0 otherwise. While if Germany loses, the contrary applies. So we will have still post-match equals to 1 and post-loss equals to 1, while post-win will be equal to 0. We estimate the regression I just showed you through two methodologies. One, through Poisson regression results, take into account the counting distribution of the variable of attacks against immigrants. While in the second case, we estimate the same regression through ordinary least square. Here are the results. What we see is that after a loss, so you see the coefficient of post-loss, the number of attacks increases, while after a win, the number of attacks decreases. Okay, you see the length of the line is the 95% confidence interval. As you see, in the case of post-win, sometimes this line crosses the zero line, meaning a null effect. So we can depict this as not very strong statistical evidence for the effect of winning match. On the other hand, we can also look at the sides of the coefficients, because we see that the coefficients of post-loss, so after Germany lose, is more higher in terms of magnitude. So the effect is not perfectly symmetric between win and losses. While the estimation strategy, so using ordinary least square or Poisson coefficient, basically lead to the same results. In the paper, I also show that also in terms of magnitude, the two estimated effects are very likely the same. So now we might argue that we found a relationship between sports and attacks against immigrants. However, we might doubt what is in the middle of this effect. So we do not know really why football matches affect attacks against immigrants. This is our evidence is only from the first column to the last one, while we do not have much information on what happened into the middle. A way to add some evidence on the transmission channel of our causal effect, I have two more results to show you. The first is that we look at attitude against immigrants, so not actual behavior, attacks, but attitude, so what people think about immigrants. And then we will also look at mood, so reported mood of people interviewed during the European Social Survey. What we basically do is that we compare answers of different respondents before or after matches of their national team. This is something done also in another very related paper from De Petris et al. What we do is that we estimate a regression where on the left side of the equation we have the response being or attitude against immigrants or mood attitude, and then on the right we have again our coefficients for post-match or post-results and a bunch of fixed effects to take into account calendar fluctuations. Using this, we show that after a winning match of the national team, this is a sample of all European countries, but we show also results only for Germany, the reported attitude against immigrants becomes more positive, while after a lost match of the German national team, the effect is somehow null. You see here on the figure on the left, figure 7. Well, on the figure 8, we try to compare the reported mood state before or after the match. Again, after a winning match, the coefficient is positive, meaning that a winning match has a positive effect on the mood of people interviewed, while after a negative match, so a lost match, the reported mood that does not seem to differ much. Again, in both cases, we do not have strong statistical significance. So I will be very, let's say, I will not say that this is strong evidence for the causal mechanism we described before, but still is an attempt to be transparent on our work. Also, as you see, when we only look at German respondents, the statistical significance is very feeble. And the reason why I explain also it in the paper is that we have, if we only look at one country, we really have less and less observation because interviews are clustered in certain period. So far in our main results, we only looked at what happened in 2 days just after the match. However, we might be interested also in looking at what happens after these 2 days after the match. But the main obstacle to do such kind of exercise is that matches are played in very close short time period, meaning that we are not able to disentangle what happened after a match without taking into account that there is a match just the days after. So a solution to this would be to create a block of matches. Unfortunately, the number of observations we have do not allow for such kind of exercise. So, as an alternative way, and also to give more narrative, descriptive evidence of our main argument, I want to show you here now this picture, this 4 plot. So, what we see here is basically that when Germany at the end won the tournament, so for example in the panel in the top left and the bottom left, the attacks on immigrants decreased together by winning of the football team. While in the top right, what we see is something opposite. So we see that in the UEFA Euro Cup, Germany arrived till the final in France, and when the football team was arriving in the final, the number of attacks decreased, while arriving at the end, they lose the final, and just after, the number of attacks continue again to rise. So this is not really an econometric evidence, it's just to give you a descriptive narrative story of what happened in this type of tournaments. So that's all by me. Thank you again for listening here till now. I hope I somehow persuaded you that football is something more than a simple game. And please give me feedback, comments, and suggestions. Also, if you think that this doesn't make sense at all, or if you think it's interesting, or if you think there are some issues with the estimation technique, or whatever. And thanks again for your attention, and hope to see you soon around somewhere, somehow. Thank you again. Bye bye. Ciao.